I am William Milberg. I'm a professor of economics and the dean of the New School for Social Research. And my area of research is international trade, international finance, and income distribution. So kind of the whole globalization story and how it relates to income distribution. My focus has been on the US, but has been really global in the sense of focusing on the relation between outsourcing in developing countries and its impact both on those countries and on the rich countries, in specifically the U.S. So the question is my interest in global value chains. Yeah, I mean, I've been an international trade economist for decades and have worked on both the theory of and the empirical assessment of the impact on international trade on people and on their incomes and on economic growth and development. And you know, my training is very much outside of economic orthodoxy, and my tendency is very much to kind of be critical of economic orthodoxy when I think it leads us astray or is based on kind of a set of assumptions about the world that are simply out of touch. And so I've explored, you know, for decades now, kind of heterodox theories of international trade and globalization and the implications of those for labor markets. And that really has led me to global value chains for two reasons. One is that the firm is pretty much absent from the traditional theory of trade, whereas the company and its internal organization and relations are really, from my perspective, where all the action is. Mm-hmm. And secondly, the international trade system is largely driven by private companies, and therefore the role of profits and the use of those profits becomes really central to the narrative in a number of very important ways. One is the obvious way that profits are part of income flows, and therefore they are part of an important part of income distribution and the distribution of value that comes out of production and then international exchange. And secondly, profits are important because in some ways they are the centerpiece of economic growth and development. And the notion that a country or some geographical entity expands its economic production and economic activity comes from an old idea that economies can produce surpluses, and those surpluses can then be invested, as it were, not for immediate consumption, but for future expansion of consumption. So the use of profits for reinvestment and then expansion, what we call economic development, is, you know, the centerpiece of the whole analysis, I think, of the importance of international trade for understanding the world economy.
For you personally, looking ahead to the next 3 or 5 years, what are particularly interesting or challenging research agendas that the GVC framework can help address?
Yeah, I think there's many exciting, fruitful research areas which have been opened up by the global value chain perspective, and which, with all this interest in global value chains on the part of both academic researchers, international organizations, policymakers, you know, we're likely to start seeing, you know, increasingly research on these new areas. And I think they have to do with a couple of things. One is how companies are regulated and how companies are governed. And the governance of lead firms, the governance of large intermediate firms, the governance of small supplier firms or large supplier firms matters for the outcomes for people. Mm-hmm. And so I think the issue of what are the pressures on these organizations for their decisions in terms of how to produce, where to produce, and what price to produce at, are going to become increasingly the scope of research. Shareholder pressures on corporations, financial pressures on companies at all points in the value chain, and how this relates to their labor management relations, their technological innovation decisions, and their kind of marketing will all play out, I think, as a result of these kinds of pressures. So I think understanding the financial side of corporations and integrating that with the analysis of their production decisions is something that will lead to some very interesting results. It's been somewhat researched, but not excessively, not adequately. And I think that what that points to is looking at tax policy, looking at transfer pricing policy, and looking at kind of labor standards and environmental standards in relation to ways that companies are pressured by shareholders, for example. So that's one area, is the financialization of the corporation. Another I was going to say is something that's come up at this conference, has begun to bubble up at this conference, which is the kind of difference between large countries and their participation in these supply chains and small countries, and not just that, but also the difference between kind of already existing participants in value chains and those who do not yet participate, and the kind of desperation to get into a supply chain. You know, I'm reminded of this Joan Robinson quote, a famous economist from Cambridge who said that you know, the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited at all. And I think this desperate need to get into value chains creates a whole challenge for policy, which then subsequently leads to considerations of, you know, what are the social standards that emerge out of that. And I think that difference between already existing and trying to get into value chains and the policy difference that is required in those two instances is another area for research.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, desperate is a I like that choice of word.